Welcome, everyone, to the Culinary Now podcast. I'm Matt Britt.
And I'm Jamie Schick. And today we are joined.
We'll try it again.
Start that over. I don't know why I can't talk right now.
All right. Welcome, everyone, to the Culinary Now podcast. I'm Matt Britt.
And I'm Jamie Schick. And today we have joining us Kelly D'Amico. And we are so excited to chat with you about all things sustainability. So welcome to our podcast.
Thanks so much for having me.
So to start us off, I'm just going to let you introduce yourself and kind of tell us about your background and what you do. And then we'll jump into some more nitty gritty topics on this.
Yeah, sure. Thanks so much. So I'm Kelly D'Amico. I'm out of New Jersey, and I run a food blog and podcast called Made to Sustain. My background's in food science and nutrition. I've got my master's degree in global food technology and innovation, and I've really always had a passion for environmentalism and, kind of protecting the planet. I'm super excited to kind of marry those two together because I think the food industry is a huge cause of climate change, and it's going to be hugely impacted if we don't do anything about it. So, love to help people understand where their food comes from and how it relates back to the planet.
Glad to have another fellow podcaster on, first and foremost. And I definitely want to dive into the climate change thing later in the episode. But if we can just go back, because it seems like you've worked a fair amount on creating this life through education, through your own work around sustainability. So can you give us kind of a glimpse into when you realized this was important and what were you talking about when that moment happened?
Yeah. So as I mentioned, I've kind of always had an interest in environmentalism. I grew up in a town that's, if you're not familiar with what a Superfund site is, it didn't quite make the mark for publicity reasons, but a Superfund site is basically a very highly polluted town and an area that's just really overall not great to be in for long extended periods of time. And that's where I grew up. So super fun fact. So just from, growing up in that environment and hearing all about all of these things and, hey, you can't go there because they used to dump chemicals in that brook and, it was always very prohibitive. So it was always like, well, I want to be able to go in that brook. How can I do that? And it's, well, you got to care about the planet to do that. So that's a little bit about where I, how I got involved, first interest in it. But then, I decided I wanted to go to school for food science and learned a lot about food science. I initially wanted to make healthier food taste better because I always found that was a challenge, right? Especially, when I was going to school, the healthy food tasted pretty bad, but people were buying it because, it had the better for them appeal to it. So I went to school for that, started to work in industry for a couple of years, realized that, you kind of have to go where the money is. And then realized that companies have to go where the money is, not necessarily just because it's something that sounds great to do, right? And so after that, I went back to school for my master's. And then as I'm going through school and learning about all of these different classes, I tried to find a way to integrate sustainability into that because I was really interested in it. And then I took a class on supply chain and learned about, all of these different nuances that go into figuring out, from the packaging, right, from glass versus plastic to transportation to food miles and learning about that. And it was really eye-opening to me learning that there's so much more that goes into it besides, what we see in the actual package. And then when I was doing my thesis, so we call it a capstone. So when I was doing my capstone project, we actually decided to base it around consumers and food sustainability and helping them understand what sustainability means as it relates to food. And what we realized was people at the time didn't really care about sustainability. Like in the plant-based movement was really on the uptick when I was doing my capstone. And we realized that people cared more about the health benefits of plant-based than the sustainability claims of plant-based. So, but the goal of my group project was to figure out how do we get people to care about sustainability because it is super important. And we realized that one of the main challenges was people just didn't understand enough about what it meant to be a sustainable product. And then After I graduated, it was COVID, and Made to Sustain was born out of a COVID project, and it's been going on ever since. So super thrilled to still be talking about it a few years later.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I think you hit the nail on the head that it's not that people don't care, it's that they don't understand. They don't understand how sustainability works or what that really means, especially in a food application. And one thing that you've said is that a meal should sustain both you and the environment. And can you kind of give an example of how you implement that or how people can implement that in their life?
Yeah, so I started out doing a lot of recipes on my site, and I still do a lot of recipes, but it's leaning more today towards sustainability. But just an example of that is finding ways that you can use local foods and foods that are grown in a way that are responsible, right? So one of my favorite examples is beans. They're so humble, but beans are so great. They're used in so many different types of cuisines, and they're great because beans are nitrogen fixing. So they actually help regenerate the soil after other crops have been planted there and taken the nitrogen out of the soil. Beans actually help replenish that nitrogen, so it helps sustain the soil for a little bit longer. So they're a great crop in terms of using that. So they're one of those um, foods that are have a lot of protein and fiber and other micronutrients in them. And then when you mix them with things like rice or other grains, they become really, really hearty and really filling. So that's one of my favorite examples of a meal that can sustain you and the planet is just figuring out, it doesn't necessarily have to be 100% plant-based meals, even though, I'm a firm believer in a plant-forward diet, but it doesn't, I think people are of the impression that they either need to be 100% plant-based or there's no other option. So I just like to throw that out there. It's not as complicated as you might think. Just including and incorporating some of these responsibly grown crops, locally grown crops, in-season crops is just a really great place to start and a really great way to start to nourish you and the planet.
And I think that education component is so important, and it is something that people they just don't know about. Like we as chefs and people that have worked in food systems in the industry, we do take cooking for granted. We take the ability to cook good food and to access good food and to prepare food as something that is easy. I think cooking can be really daunting to a lot of people, and when we start talking about sustainability, it could we could run the risk of adding another level of unapproachableness to food, which I think a lot of people feel. But one thing I know you believe, and maybe you can comment on this, is that there are other areas in people's lives where they're already maybe even doing sustainable stuff, right? Whether it's through the bed they sleep on or what they're wearing. And is there a way or a tip that you have on how people that maybe are a little bit timid about food can leverage their current successes in sustainability and then apply that on at a more easier, like you mentioned, beans are really approachable, but a lot of people don't know that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, and I think that's a great question. I think a lot of times people do things that are environmentally friendly and they don't realize it, or they think the impact is so small that it's negligible. But really, the greatest thing that we can do is if everyone takes those steps, right? Because then collectively that impact is much greater. And that's something I think a lot of times is forgotten along the way. But things, and we cover this a lot on the Made to Sustain website. Things like just reusing your leftovers, storing your food once you're done with it in glass containers versus a plastic container. And that doesn't necessarily mean, you need to go out and buy brand new containers. Maybe you can just use what you already have in a way that's um, just taking those small actions, right? So another thing I like to use is I'm in New Jersey, right? And we have a ban on plastic bags in the grocery store. So that means we all need to bring our own. But when you go to the grocery store in the produce aisle, they still have plastic bags that you can store your produce in. And that's kind of defeating the purpose of getting away from plastic bags. So you can, reuse those plastic bags or buy reusable mesh totes or things like that. So it's just tiny, tiny tips like that, really small incremental changes that really make an impact in the long run. One of my favorite things that we started to do kind of over COVID and over the pandemic was composting our food. And that helped us reduce the volume of trash that we use. And I know it sounds strange, but it helps us reduce the volume of food waste in our own house, to the point where, if we miss trash day, we're going to be fine. Our trash doesn't stink. And then it's great because I can just throw it in my plants. So, and in my garden beds and things like that. So they're really small, tiny changes, some bigger than others. I'd say, switching to a reusable glass container is a much easier switch than asking somebody to start composting. But I think there's a wide range of ways that you can do it at home that don't need to be incredibly daunting, and they can actually be really simple and beneficial to you in the long run.
I think that's some great advice. And I know we keep going back to the bean example, but beans are very affordable.
Mhm.
And I think that's helpful because if you think about it, and I do want to talk about other products such as like lotions or shampoos and things like that, where as people start to use up what they already have, but they're looking for a more sustainable approach or a more holistic approach to what they're putting on their body. Are there other ways people can start or things people can look for when they're buying those like personal products, soaps, lotions, shampoos, things like that, that could also help and maybe be a little bit more affordable?
Yeah, so I'm definitely not an expert in the personal care space. But what I can speak upon is that just because it's natural doesn't always mean more sustainable. So, just an example that I like to use, things like essential oils actually take huge, huge, huge volumes to create, like, kilograms for one tiny ounce of essential oil. So that doesn't necessarily mean always more sustainable. And I think those two terms are used interchangeably. But until you start going in and doing the research and understanding, what kinds of claims are these companies making, what kinds of, what are they telling me, what sounds too good to be true and what actually is true. I think just always taking a little bit of skepticism, and just do a little bit of research on whatever product you're about to buy. If you really want to make a concerted effort to making and choosing more sustainable products, that's one way to do it. Another way, I've actually built out a sustainable brand directory on madetosustain.com,
Nice.
to kind of help people navigate that space a little bit more. So I can't speak on behalf of all things personal care, but I have vetted a few brands that we keep on there. So, but a few things. I guess if you just want a few actionable tips, things like reusable packaging, compostable packaging, or a backyard compostable is really important. I know there's some really cool
Mhm.
companies doing refill programs and things like that. Can't speak to the rest of their sustainability initiatives, but things like that are a great place to start if you're just looking to make a quick switch.
So I guess, and this is all well and good, and I'm with you. I think making these choices not only is good for your soul, but it's also good for the planet, right? The elephant, I guess, if there is one in the room, is sort of this cost, right? And I have seen this, and I'm sure you've heard this from everyone that you've talked to. Is all right. I'm going green. That means I'm paying more, right? Whether that's the car you drive, or the soap you buy, or the produce that you're eating. How do you get around the idea that, like, yeah, maybe doing things better, that was really good English, by the way. But maybe doing things, maybe doing things the right way might hit your wallet a little bit more short term, but the long term benefits will outweigh that. How do you cross that skepticism?
Yeah, it's huge. And I don't think consumers are alone in that. Big brands are also facing that as well, right? So farmers know. So, like, I just actually did a webinar on this. Farmers, it takes investment for them to change their farming style. And then for them, it's a risk, right? Because if it's going to work or not, they don't know because they've been doing the same thing for a long amount of time. So it's hard to convince the farmer to take that risk and investment in their land, to make more sustainable crops. So things like regenerative, for example. So that's one method, and then that's passed on to the ingredient manufacturers who have to pay the farmers more to more investment in those crops. CPGs are then passed along that cost, and then CPGs want to pass along that cost to the consumer because they know it's going to cost more. The consumers, they're saying, I don't want to pay this extra cost. Inflation is already through the roof. My budget's already so thin, and it really comes along. There's an entire food supply chain, and I don't think one entity needs to hold on to that cost. It can be a shared cost, but the cost of not doing something is greater than the consequences of what's going to happen in the long run. So, one of my favorite examples of this is regenerative agriculture. Yes, it takes more resources and monetary inputs to grow in a regenerative manner, but in return, you're going to get healthier soil, which means that we're going to have longevity in crop cycles for the long term. And then in turn, you get healthier crops. And when we eat healthier crops, crops that have more flavor, as chefs, right? That's super important. If they taste better, they're grown better. We see more value in them, and they're better for us in the long term. There's more taste and flavor involved. That's really a win right there for our health in the long term. There's lots of studies right now. The Nutrient Density Alliance just did a study that regeneratively grown crops are more nutritionally dense than conventionally grown crops. And then, there's also some other studies that are showing that like a broccoli or an apple today, even though it has the same amount of calories in it, does not have the same nutritional composition as it did 40 years ago. So it's just a really interesting dynamic that we have to consider is, what's going to be better for general populations in terms of nutrition in the long run, for the soil quality, for everything else. And I know nobody wants to talk about the cost. It is the elephant in the room, but it is better for everything in the long run. And I'm not saying that every time, you need to go broke over doing this stuff or run yourself into debt. But I think just, if you have the choice, if you're able to afford it, if you're in a position where it makes financial sense, try to opt for a better option, or, in terms of, a sustainable choice, go without, right? Consumerism is another thing that we can always talk about too.
Yeah, for sure. As you're talking, I'm thinking about all these big companies, and I know that you work with big companies and you consult with them to help them make their practices more sustainable and to eliminate or reduce their food waste. And when you work with those companies, are there things that you see all these companies are kind of always doing this one thing that they could improve on, kind of like their biggest offenses, like something you see repeatedly happening that you're consulting and teaching on in these large companies?
Yeah, I think every company is different. But in terms, I can speak to my expertise in the B2B ingredient space. A lot of them, a lot of the big companies don't want to make the investment in things like regenerative agriculture or in more sustainable farming practices because they're afraid of the risk. And they're afraid of being the first one to market. There's a reason you haven't seen a major CPG brand come out and take a big stance on something like, regenerative agriculture. Like our product is now, think of like your favorite name brand, national brand, right? There's a reason they haven't come out and said like, we're going to be 100% regeneratively grown tomatoes, so that way your ketchup is going to be regenerative. They're too afraid to take on the risk of doing that. And I think it's a little chickeny. There's no reason you should wait for somebody else to make the first step. I think this is an opportunity for big brands and just small brands, any brand, to be a leader in this space and to take the first, take the first step, be the first one, be a leader.
But Kelly, let me ask you a question on that, because I feel like I'm gonna stretch here,
Sure.
but I feel like taking that first step is something that needs to happen. But
Mhm.
like, if I'm being sort of devil's advocate, I can see the being risk averse is like a viable like concern, because I look at the electric car market, right? There have been several real big pushes by pretty major companies to go electric, and you've seen them retract, right? Because either the technology is not there, the consumer demand isn't there. Do you think that these companies, and I agree with you, I think they need to be bolder, but do you think these companies are also like to your point, they're waiting for someone else to fail? They want to see what is the unknown before they go all in. And at that point, it's just like it's not being chicken, it's a game of chicken. It's like, who's going to go first, right? And who's going to take that plunge? And then who's going to make the mistake? And then how can we not make that same mistake? Like, do you think there's a company that's close to taking the leap, or do you think we're just going to be in this perpetual like who's going first mentality for a while?
Yeah, I think it's going to be the who's going first mentality for a long time,
That's
unfortunately.
great.
Um, just just based on so one example, like you brought up the EV market, right? But in more, closer to home in the food market, think of the plant based industry and
Yes.
the 100% plant based, and so many companies, Impossible and Beyond still growing strong. They're doing great, even though their sales aren't as they're not as big as the market predicted that they would be, but they're still doing phenomenal, right? And they're still doing
Mhm.
great. The complaints are still there that cost is still too high, but so many companies, big companies like shut down their plant-based manufacturing facilities because they just weren't profitable. Whether or not the products weren't good, I don't know. I didn't taste all of them. There were a lot on the market to choose from. But I think a lot of companies are feeling risk averse because a lot of them made big investments and big bets in that space. And this is just in very close succession another big risk that they might not want to take. And I don't know. That's just me speculating, but I think that might have something to do with it.
Matt, I don't know if we can hear you.
I lost your audio for a second.
No, no, no. We're good. We're good. Sorry. Kelly, I have one quick thing. And Jamie, I know you've been waiting for a while on this, but I really am happy you brought it back to the plant based side of things because, yes, there are some big players that, Impossible Beyond that are doing well. Excuse me. Um, but it goes back to one of your original points, which is maybe just not consuming is a solution in of itself because I've talked to a lot of people that are vegetarians or plant focused, and their like sort of love or their feeling on these sort of plant-based alternatives isn't great. It's more they'd almost just rather eat less animal protein or just eat vegetables, right? So is it sounds like what you're saying is just maybe cutting down a little bit altogether could be a really viable way to start. And I use the plant based as an example of that.
Yeah, and I mean, I'll look at it at meat consumption first because meat consumption is one of the biggest emitters of. It's actually second under transportation in terms of largest emitters of fossil fuels and contributors to greenhouse gas emissions. Um, and it's huge in the culinary space. But if we can start, and I think chefs play an important role in this, including more vegetarian options on the menu or more plant forward options on the menu is a great place to start. If you've ever been to any kind of barbecue, right, or a luncheon, and there's like 5 vegetarian sandwiches and like 20 conventional ham and cheese, for example, right? The vegetarians are almost always gone first. And so people are really seeking it. And
Yes.
I think we need to, it's a good time to shift our thinking around, does a plate need to be a protein, a starch, and a vegetable? Definitely not. And I think chefs play a huge part in allowing people to open up their creativity and change their thinking around, where a protein does not have to be the center of the plate. How can I make seasonal vegetables be the center of the plate? How can I make them taste delicious in a way that's healthy for people? And I think there's just a huge opportunity. And I think restaurants are the perfect place to start. People understanding that, this, it doesn't have to be the way that we've always done it going forward.
I mean, look at restaurants like 11 Madison who are completely vegetable focused, and I actually just ate there over the summer, so I have firsthand experience, but it's not high there's no protein. They don't use fake protein. They highlight seasonal vegetables, and yes, there is some starch, of course, but it was all vegetable courses, and I think that they're doing a great job of putting that concept out there.
Yeah, I've eaten at a few restaurants. There's one in New Jersey called Heirloom Kitchen. I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, but they're amazing doing the same thing. They've got a seasonal menu, things are always rotating. Another one that's really widely known is Blue Hill at Stone Farm
Mhm.
Center. They did an amazing job. I ate there over the summer too. So there's so many thought leaders in this space. I wish it would become more mainstream because there's nothing more that I love than going out to a good restaurant.
Well, thinking of the idea of mainstream, and this kind of goes back to what you talked about a little while ago, but you're talking about how these big companies don't want to be first. And And it costs money to do this. Are there not grants or funding that they can apply for to help them do this? And maybe there's not. I don't actually know.
Yeah, I'm definitely not an expert in this space, but what I have heard from colleagues in the space who are a little bit more familiar, the funding's just not there.
Mm.
It's really set aside right now for conventional farming, and that's where the subsidies are. But it's just a little slow moving towards the more progressive farming style and regenerative space. Hopefully, it changes. But I really can't give you an update on that because unfortunately, I don't know.
No, and I think that that's rooted in sort of just our history, right? We've always lobbied for and put forward this idea of animal protein, conventional farming, center of the plate. But, if you're listening to this and you do have a stage or you are in a position to, advocate on behalf of a more plant centric plate, I mean, feel agency to do that, because I think that that's how it has to start, right? It has to go from the ground up, and people have to realize that not only is eating more plant centric, being more sustainable, better for the earth, but it's just better for your own personal health. I mean, we don't need to be eating as much as we do traditionally. So
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And I think another thing consumers don't necessarily realize is their wallet holds a lot of power. So
bingo.
companies are going to be moving towards the things that are, um, they're going to be moving towards the things consumers are gravitating towards. So if there's, a more, I don't know, not more sustainable. If there's a drive towards, companies putting out like Oatly, right, putting out their carbon footprint per package, more companies are going to start to take the lead. I know Beyond and Impossible, just not to, I'm not promoting them. Don't worry, I'm not sponsored or anything by them. But they also put out like an LCA and their carbon footprint. So it's becoming more popular and more mainstream. I still think that consumer education piece is missing, but as soon as brands start seeing that consumers are gravitating more towards transparency, more towards more sustainable choices and sustainable practices, that's where they're going to move towards. And I think that's just something that we don't realize.
Well, Kelly, if anyone wants to find out more information or contact you, can you let everyone know where they can find your podcast and your website and any services that you may provide?
Yeah, thanks so much. So you can definitely find out a whole bunch of sustainability education related material on my website, madetosustain.com. If you're looking to start a little bit more in this plant centric space but don't know where to start, we're actually working on creating meal plans for people and with grocery lists, so you can start incorporating that a little bit more. It's also great for chefs for recipe inspiration.
Awesome.
So just that's one area. You can find me on social media channels at Made to Sustain, all one word, all lowercase. And then definitely check out my podcast. It's been going really great so far. We're just wrapping up season 1, and that's on all platforms: Apple, Spotify, and I think it's on YouTube too. But that's just the Made to Sustain podcast.
Nice. All right, Kelly, thank you so much for taking the time today, and keep fighting the good fight.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.